One day, a little while after Jesus had set off for Jerusalem, Daniel came bursting into Tammie's kitchen. "Is the rabbi here?" he asked. "I hope I'm not too late. Father says I can go to Jerusalem for the Passover. He feels too old for the journey, and as Mother and James and John are already there with Jesus, I was going to stay with him, but he reckons he'll be all right." "That's the point of us staying behind," said Naomi, "to look after anyone on their own. He can celebrate the feast with us." "That'd be great, I'll tell him," said Daniel. "But has the rabbi set off yet? Father says I have to go in his party." "Don't worry," laughed Naomi. "They're leaving tomorrow. You've got time to go home and pack up some things. What would your mother say if we let you go all that way without your warm cloak?" "You are lucky," said Tammie the next day as she stood in the courtyard waiting to wave them off. "I know," said Daniel. "Jerusalem at Pesach, with so many people gathered there. It's very special." "It's loads more special these days," said Tammie. "You know why I really think you're so lucky?" Daniel nodded. "Jesus is there," he said, thrilled. "To be there with him at the most holy time of the year. He'll be keeping a low profile, but hopefully we'll see him a few times. You never know, we may even hear him teach right there in the city of King David. Oh, Tam, it's going to be excellent." "You must remember everything and tell me about it when you get back," said Tammie. "Promise." "Course I will," said Daniel, when they were interrupted by a loud and very pointed cough. "Excuse me," said Jairus. "I hate to break things up, but we're about to leave." Daniel hurried off to join the group that had formed, and Tammie gave her father a big hug. "Have an amazing time and a very safe journey," she said. "I'll climb up onto the roof to wave you into the distance." Once the little group had disappeared, Tammie slipped back down to the courtyard. There was lots to be done in the few remaining days. She joined Caleb in tending the animals and cleaning out their stalls. Benjamin had gone with Jairus to Jerusalem, but Caleb was feeling too old these days for jaunting and gallivanting, as he called it. Soon it was the 14th day of Nisan, and the bustle reached fever pitch. From dusk it would be the 15th, the first day of the Passover, and that is when the meal would be eaten. There was a frenzy of cleaning and scrubbing and planning and cooking. All over the country, women would be burning any bread or dough with yeast in it to get rid of it, and making the unleavened bread without yeast. Men would recheck the lamb to be used tonight. It had to be perfect, without any blemishes. Those who'd gone to Jerusalem would be asking around for a guest room, as it was the custom for the people of Jerusalem to allow travellers to use any spare rooms that they might have. There would be a long queue at the temple. Jairus would probably be there now, Tammie thought. They would be taking the lambs to be killed at the altar as a sacrifice for their sins. The sun got lower and lower in the sky, and everywhere people gathered together. In the villages, in farm settlements, in the cities. In the homes of neighbours, in the homes of strangers. In tents on the hills around Jerusalem, in isolated groups on foreign soil. There was a hushed excitement over all God's people. It was Pesach, the Passover once again. In the half-light of the oil lamps, Tammie looked around at the small group gathered in her house. Everyone was wearing their sandals, and Caleb and Daniel's father Zebedee carried a staff each and wore their cloaks with the ends gathered up and tucked into their belts. This was to remember the way the first Passover was eaten hurriedly, with the people all ready to flee the country before the night was over. Caleb was representing Jairus as the host of the meal, so he said the opening prayer and blessed the first cup of wine, which was passed round everyone. Then they each took a sprig of herbs and dipped it in salt water and ate it. That was to signify the tears which the people of Israel had shed during their 400 years of slavery in Egypt. Then Caleb broke the first of the little loaves of unleavened bread, which would be eaten during the evening, and passed it round. It was unleavened to remind them that when their ancestors left Egypt, they had no time to wait for the dough to rise, so God told them to use no yeast. Tammie swallowed slightly to clear her throat, and then stood. Everyone turned to look at her, and she felt, as she did every year, what an honour it was to have a part to play in such a celebration. As the youngest person present, it was now her job to ask the host about the feast. All over the land, young people would be doing the same. Little Jakey would be standing and carefully remembering the words his mother had taught him. Somewhere in or near Jerusalem, Daniel would be asking Tammie's father. And if Jesus was with his closest followers, then John would probably be asking the question, and Jesus himself would be giving the reply. "What does this ceremony mean?" asked Tammie. "Why is this night different from any other?" Caleb answered, "It is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians. We keep this vigil to honor the Lord, because the Lord kept vigil that night to bring us out of slavery with a mighty hand." And he told the story of what had happened nearly 1,500 years before, how the Egyptian Pharaoh had ignored all God's messages to let the people of Israel go, in spite of all the plagues God had sent. How Pharaoh even made their hardship worse, driving them almost to death. How God had warned of one final, terrible plague, to kill all the firstborn. But still, Pharaoh wouldn't change his mind. Then God had told the people to kill a lamb for each family that night, and to eat the meal just as everyone was eating it now. But first of all, they were to sprinkle some of the lamb's blood around the doorframe as a sign. When the angel of death saw that, he would miss that house and not let the plague fall on it. It was as if the blood of the lamb stood in the place of the oldest son who would otherwise have died. They stayed safely huddled inside their homes until it was all over. And then they heard the heartbreaking grief of the Egyptians. At last, Pharaoh allowed them to go free from the cruel slavery they'd been under for so long, and God led them and any Egyptians who wanted to belong to him out of the country. But even then it was not over, because Pharaoh changed his mind and came racing after them with his chariots and soldiers. The people of Israel were trapped between the army and the Sea of Reeds. And then God did what no one could possibly have imagined or expected. He divided the sea into two piled up masses, with dry land in between for the people to walk across. You would have thought Pharaoh would have got the message by now, but still he wouldn't turn back. He tried to chase after them, just as all the waters came crashing back into place. The people of Israel were free at last. The story was familiar, but as they listened to Caleb tell it, with the dark night outside and the eerie, flickering twilight of the oil lamps, it was easy to imagine that God was moving across the land, even now, to save them.